Imagine stopping to help someone in need, a simple, almost automatic act of kindness. But what if that small gesture set off a chain of unexpected events? What if suddenly you were pulled into something much bigger, filled with mystery, power, and impossible choices? Anthony, an ordinary man, had no idea his life would change when he stopped to help a stranger with a flat tire. He expected nothing in return, simply following his instinct for compassion. But what happens the next day leaves him shocked. Get ready for a story where a simple favor turns into a moral dilemma, involving tempting offers, tough decisions, and a truth no one could foresee. Anthony will have to decide between staying true to his values or diving into a world of secrets. What would you do in his place? But first, comment below where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy this story full of unexpected twists and life-changing moments, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Anthony, a 35-year-old maintenance technician, was heading home after a long day of work when he spotted a car on the side of the road with a flat tire. Standing next to the vehicle was a woman, clearly distressed, struggling to figure out what to do. He pulled over, rolled down his window and asked, "Need some help? Looks like you're in a bit of trouble." Sophia, the woman in question, looked up with a mixture of relief and nervousness. "I don't know how to change the tire," she replied, her voice trembling slightly, almost as if there was more bothering her than just the flat. Without hesitation, Anthony got out of his car, grabbing his tools. "Don't worry, this will be quick," he said with a friendly smile, kneeling to get to work. He could feel the tension in the air and tried to ease it with small jokes. "Hey, you're in luck. I'm a pro at this after years in maintenance. Consider it a free roadside service," he joked, tightening the bolts. Despite his efforts to lighten the mood, something about Sophia's demeanor told him that this was more than just an ordinary roadside incident. As he worked, Anthony noticed Sophia glancing nervously around, as if she was expecting someone to show up. "Are you new around here?" he asked, trying to make small talk. She nodded and quietly replied, "I just moved to town, but I don't know many people yet." Her anxious tone caught Anthony's attention. He didn't want to pry, but it was clear that something was weighing heavily on her. "Don't worry, you'll be back on the road in no time," he assured her, focusing on finishing the job. The tire change was almost done, but the tension in the air continued to grow. Sophia, with her hands clasped tightly, watched Anthony's every move with a worried expression. "You're really helping me out a lot," she said, her voice wavering slightly. Anthony, ever the optimist, replied, "I just believe that we all need each other at times like these." He knew he was simply doing a good deed, but something inside him told him this situation wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. As Anthony finished tightening the last bolt, he noticed Sophia staring intently into her rearview mirror, as if expecting something to happen. "All set, you're good to go," he said, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. Sophia, visibly relieved but still uneasy, thanked him with a small smile. "Thank you so much. I owe you," she said almost apologetically. Anthony just nodded and smiled. "No worries, we all need a little help sometimes," he replied. After packing up his tools, Anthony waved goodbye to Sophia, but her expression lingered in his mind. "Take care, and if you need anything, I'm around," he said, walking back to his car. Sophia got into her car quickly and drove off in a hurry, leaving Anthony standing by the roadside, watching her disappear into the distance. The feeling that something was off stuck with him. He tried to brush it off, reminding himself that he had just done a good deed, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. Back in his car, Anthony fastened his seatbelt and let out a deep breath, trying to shake off the discomfort. "Maybe I'm overthinking this," he muttered to himself as he started the engine. However, as he drove home, the image of Sophia kept replaying in his mind. She was scared of something, but what? He wondered aloud. He knew he had done the right thing, but a small voice inside him said that this story wasn't over yet. As he continued driving, Anthony couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. Sometimes a small act of kindness can set off a chain of events, he thought. He had always believed in the power of small gestures, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. "It's funny how life puts us in situations we don't expect," he mused. Could this mean something bigger? He questioned himself as the radio played softly in the background. When Anthony finally arrived home, he parked the car in the garage, but his mind was still on the encounter by the road. He walked into his house, tossed his keys on the table, and headed straight to the kitchen for a glass of water. Staring out the window, the scene of Sophia, nervous by the side of the road, kept replaying in his mind. "I just changed a tire. Why can't I stop thinking about it?" he asked himself as the quiet of the night settled in. He moved to the living room, sat down on the couch and turned on the TV, hoping to distract himself. But no matter what he did, his thoughts kept drifting back to that moment. What could she have been hiding, he wondered. Anthony had always been someone who believed that the universe had a way of showing us the right path, and he was beginning to feel that there was more to this story than just a simple good deed. "Maybe I'll find out soon enough," he thought, half skeptical, but with a growing curiosity. As he got ready for bed, Anthony glanced at the clock and realized that he had spent hours thinking about the encounter. "This is ridiculous, I just changed a tire," he said, trying to put an end to his restless thoughts. But deep down he knew that no matter how hard he tried, this story would continue to follow him in the days to come. There was something about Sophia, something he couldn't quite figure out. Maybe it was her nervousness or the way she seemed so relieved, yet still on edge. Lying in bed, Anthony stared at the ceiling, thinking about the importance of small acts of kindness. He had always believed that helping others was a fundamental part of living a meaningful life. "Maybe what I did today will have a bigger impact than I realize," he reflected. Yet the unease in his mind remained. What if this encounter was the beginning of something much larger, he wondered, as sleep began to take over. One thing was certain. In time, the truth would reveal itself. The next morning, Anthony woke up feeling slightly uneasy. The thoughts of the previous night still lingered in his mind, but he pushed them aside as he prepared for another day of work. As he stepped outside to head to his car, something caught his eye. Parked across the street, almost blending in with the shadows, was a black SUV. Its tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside. Anthony furrowed his brow. "That's odd," he muttered to himself. He didn't recall seeing that car in the neighborhood before. Shaking off the initial unease, Anthony got into his car and drove off. But as he pulled onto the main road, he couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The black SUV was following him, maintaining a steady distance. His heart rate picked up slightly, but he reminded himself that it could just be a coincidence. There are plenty of black SUVs out there, he thought, trying to calm the nervous feeling creeping up his spine. Still, the sight of that vehicle in his mirrors was unsettling. Throughout the day, Anthony went about his usual routine, but the presence of the SUV lingered in the back of his mind. Every time he stopped somewhere, whether for a quick coffee or at a client's house for a repair job, he would spot that same black vehicle parked nearby. "This is getting weird," he thought, wiping his hands on a rag after finishing a job. He started to wonder if this had anything to do with Sophia. Had she gotten into some kind of trouble? The more he thought about it, the more uneasy he became. By lunchtime, Anthony's unease had turned into full-fledged paranoia. "Maybe it's nothing," he muttered to himself as he sat in his car eating a sandwich. But as soon as he looked up, there it was. The black SUV, parked just down the street. It hadn't moved since he arrived. He could feel his palms starting to sweat. "Okay, this is not a coincidence anymore," he thought, tossing the rest of his lunch aside. His mind raced with possibilities. Was someone watching him? And if so, why? Anthony's thoughts kept circling back to the previous day, to Sophia and her nervous behavior. Could she have been in some kind of danger? He wondered. It didn't seem likely that a simple act of helping her change a tire would lead to something like this. But as much as he tried to rationalize the situation, the unease continued to gnaw at him. What if I've gotten myself involved in something I didn't mean to? He pondered, staring at the black SUV once again. His gut told him this was far from over. In the afternoon, Anthony decided to take a different route back home. He wanted to see if the SUV would follow him again. As he made an unexpected turn down a side street, he glanced in his mirrors. The SUV hesitated for a moment, but eventually followed. That was all the confirmation he needed. They're definitely following me, he thought, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. His mind raced with questions. Who were these people? And more importantly, what did they want from him? Back at home, Anthony tried to carry on with his evening as usual, but the constant presence of the SUV weighed heavily on his mind. He stood by the window, watching as the black vehicle remained parked across the street, seemingly waiting for something or someone. What are they doing? He whispered to himself. The tension in his chest was building, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It was unsettling, to say the least, and for the first time, Anthony felt a sense of real danger creeping into his life. As the days passed, the black SUV continued to show up in different parts of Anthony's routine. Whether he was leaving for work or coming back home, it was always there, lurking. Anthony tried to ignore it, but the constant reminder that he was being followed made it impossible to fully relax. Why me? He kept asking himself. He had done nothing more than help a stranger with a flat tire, but now it seemed like that single act of kindness had brought something dark and mysterious into his world. One evening, while Anthony was sitting in his living room, he heard the faint sound of a car door closing outside. He jumped up and peered through the curtains. The SUV was still there, but this time 2 figures emerged from the vehicle. Anthony's heart skipped a beat. They were just standing by the car, not making any moves toward his house. "What is this?" he whispered, his pulse quickening. The figures eventually got back into the SUV and drove off, leaving Anthony more confused and on edge than ever. At work, Anthony tried to focus on his tasks, but his mind was elsewhere. His colleagues noticed his distracted demeanor. "You all right, man?" "You seem a little off," one of them asked. Anthony forced a smile. "Yeah, just dealing with some stuff," he replied vaguely. He didn't want to bring up the SUV or the mysterious people who seemed to be tracking his every move, but the more he kept it to himself, the more isolated he felt. He was starting to realize that whatever this was, it wasn't going to go away on its own. By the end of the week, Anthony was fed up with the constant surveillance. "I need to confront this head-on," he thought, his frustration mounting. But how? He didn't even know who was behind the wheel of that SUV. Was it connected to Sophia, or was there something else at play? He had no answers, only more questions. "Maybe I should talk to someone about this," he considered, but quickly dismissed the idea. Who would even believe me? Anthony decided to take matters into his own hands. He started keeping a closer eye on the SUV, memorizing the license plate number and jotting down the times it appeared in his neighborhood. He even considered going to the police, but what would he say? "Hey, I'm being followed by a black SUV." It sounded ridiculous even to him. Still, the sense of being watched had become too intense to ignore. "I have to figure this out," he told himself, determined to get to the bottom of it. Late one night, Anthony sat by the window waiting. The black SUV was parked in its usual spot, and he was done with being passive. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached the vehicle, the engine roared to life and the SUV sped off into the night. Anthony stood there, watching the taillights fade into the distance. "They know I'm onto them," he thought, a mix of frustration and fear settling in. Whoever they weren't ready to be confronted just yet. The SUV didn't return the following day, and for a brief moment, Anthony felt a sense of relief. Maybe whoever was following him had decided to back off. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. The mystery surrounding the SUV and its occupants was far from solved. "This is just the beginning," he murmured, staring at the empty street. Whatever was coming next, Anthony was certain that he was in for more than he had bargained for. The following day, as Anthony went about his morning routine, his mind kept returning to Sophia. Her anxious behavior during the tire change had seemed more than just situational stress. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper going on. She was way too nervous, he thought, sipping his coffee while staring out the window. The black SUV hadn't returned yet, but the questions swirling in his mind wouldn't settle. What was she afraid of? And why did it feel like he was now part of whatever she was running from? As the day progressed, Anthony replayed the interaction in his head. Sophia had been fidgeting the entire time, her eyes constantly darting around as if she expected someone to appear out of nowhere. He remembered her voice trembling slightly when she thanked him, her words rushed, almost as if she didn't want to stay in one place too long. "There's no way that was just about a flat tire," Anthony muttered to himself, while driving to his next job. His instincts told him that Sophia was hiding something big. Later that afternoon, while taking a break from work, Anthony's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Thank you again for helping me yesterday. I really appreciate it." Sophia. The simple text seemed innocent enough, but Anthony couldn't help but read between the lines. There was no mention of the SUV, no explanation for her nervousness. He debated whether to reply, unsure if it was wise to get more involved. "Do I really want to know what's going on?" he wondered, staring at the screen. Anthony decided to respond. "No problem at all. Glad I could help. Hope everything's okay with you." He hit send and immediately regretted it. Part of him wanted to leave this situation behind, but the other part, his curious side, was pulling him in deeper. Minutes passed and there was no response. "Maybe I should have just stayed out of it," he muttered, shaking his head. But something told him that whether he liked it or not, he was already in the middle of whatever was unfolding. As he continued with his work, Anthony couldn't help but feel the tension mounting. Sophia's nervousness had transferred to him, and now he was the one constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering if the black SUV would show up again. "This is ridiculous," he thought, trying to focus on his tasks. But the more he tried to push it out of his mind, the more it haunted him. He didn't know much about Sophia, but her fear was palpable, and now it seemed to be becoming his own. Later that evening, Anthony found himself pacing around his living room, unable to relax. He kept thinking about Sophia's hurried goodbyes, her unwillingness to stick around for even a brief conversation after the tire was changed. What was she running from? He asked himself for the 100th time. He remembered how her hands trembled as she fumbled with her phone, trying to call someone but giving up after a few seconds. It was clear she didn't feel safe, but why? Anthony's thoughts were interrupted by another message from the same unknown number. "I'm sorry if I seemed strange yesterday. I've just been going through a lot." That was it. No further explanation, no details. Anthony stared at the message, feeling more confused than ever. A lot could mean anything, but it didn't answer any of the questions swirling in his head. She's definitely hiding something, he thought, but now the question was, what? As the days passed, Anthony couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn deeper into Sophia's world. He kept waiting for another message or some kind of explanation, but nothing came. Instead, the silence only made the situation more unsettling. What am I missing here? He wondered. He had always trusted his gut, and right now his instincts were telling him that something big was happening, something that Sophia hadn't told him yet. One night, unable to sleep, Anthony found himself scrolling through news articles, trying to find any clue about what might be going on. He searched for anything related to Sophia's last name, the black SUV, or even strange happenings in the area, but there was nothing. I'm grasping at straws here, he admitted to himself, closing his laptop in frustration. Whatever was going on, it wasn't in the news, at least not yet. Anthony tried to tell himself that he was overreacting, that people go through personal struggles all the time, and maybe Sophia's situation was none of his business, but his instincts refused to let it go. It's more than just stress, he thought. She's scared of something or someone. He couldn't explain why, but the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that whatever Sophia was involved in, it was dangerous. The next day, Anthony received another text from Sophia. "Thank you for checking in. I'm doing better now, but things are still complicated." The vague message did nothing to calm his growing concern. He wanted to ask her directly what was going on, but he knew that pressing too hard might push her away. Instead, he replied cautiously, "I'm here if you need anything." It was an open-ended offer, but deep down, Anthony knew that he was already too involved to back out now. As the days turned into weeks, the black SUV reappeared sporadically, never staying long but always reminding Anthony that this wasn't over. Each time he saw it, he thought of Sophia's nervous face and the way she kept looking over her shoulder. "There's no way this is just a coincidence," he muttered to himself, watching the SUV from his window. Whatever was happening, it was far from resolved, and Anthony had a feeling that things were about to escalate. At work, Anthony's colleagues noticed his distracted behavior. "You've been pretty out of it lately," one of them remarked. "Everything okay?" Anthony nodded but kept his thoughts to himself. How could he explain that he was being followed and that he was wrapped up in a situation he didn't fully understand? He didn't even know how to make sense of it himself. "I just need to get to the bottom of this," he thought. But how? As the situation continued to weigh on him, Anthony decided that he needed to confront Sophia directly. He didn't know what kind of trouble she was in, but the mystery surrounding her had become too much to ignore. "I'll reach out to her one more time," he decided, drafting a message. He wasn't sure if she'd even respond, but he knew he couldn't keep tiptoeing around this. Whatever was going on, it was time to get some answers. Anthony had grown increasingly paranoid over the days. The black SUV, which had initially seemed like a coincidence, was now a daily presence in his life. No matter where he went, it was always there, whether parked down the street from his house or following him from a distance as he drove to work. His nerves were on edge, and it was becoming harder to ignore the feeling that he was under constant surveillance. "Why are they still following me?" he wondered, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the SUV trailed behind him once again. One afternoon, Anthony decided to test the persistence of the mysterious vehicle. He took an unexpected detour, driving through winding streets and residential areas he had no reason to be in. Yet each time he glanced in his rearview mirror, the SUV was there, maintaining a careful distance. "All right, this isn't just my imagination," Anthony thought, his pulse quickening. Whoever was in that SUV had a purpose, and it was clear that they weren't going away anytime soon. That night, as Anthony sat in his living room, his thoughts raced. He couldn't focus on anything else. Not the TV, not his phone, not even dinner. The SUV was out there again, parked just far enough away to be inconspicuous, but close enough to remind him of its presence. "Why are they watching me?" he asked himself for the 100th time. It didn't make sense. He was just a maintenance worker. What could they possibly want from him? And more importantly, was it connected to Sophia? The next day, as Anthony left for work, he spotted the black SUV immediately. It was waiting for him at the corner, as if anticipating his every move. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered under his breath. He considered confronting the driver, but something about the situation made him hesitate. Whoever they were, they hadn't approached him directly yet, and he wasn't sure if provoking them would be the smartest move. "Better not push my luck," he thought, driving away with a growing sense of dread. Anthony began documenting every sighting of the SUV. He jotted down the times it appeared, the streets it followed him on, and even the license plate number. He wasn't sure what he was going to do with the information, but it felt like the only control he had left in the situation. "At least I'll have proof if this gets out of hand," he told himself, though the words did little to calm his nerves. Every new sighting was another reminder that he was no longer living a normal life. The constant surveillance began to take its toll on Anthony. He found himself looking over his shoulder everywhere he went, scanning for the SUV in every parking lot, every street corner. His sleep became restless, his mind racing with thoughts of who was behind this and why they were targeting him. "I'm not crazy," he kept telling himself, but the paranoia was hard to shake. Each time he saw the SUV, it was a reminder that his life was no longer his own. At work, Anthony's colleagues started to notice his change in behavior. "You've been acting weird lately, man," one of them said, eyeing him with concern. Anthony forced a laugh, trying to brush it off. "Just dealing with some stuff," he replied vaguely, not wanting to get into the details. How could he explain that he was being followed everywhere he went? It sounded too bizarre, even to him. But the fear was real, and it was becoming harder to hide. One evening, as Anthony sat by his window, watching the SUV from a distance, he felt a surge of frustration. He had had enough of being watched, enough of living in fear. "I can't keep living like this," he muttered, pacing the room. Part of him wanted to storm outside and confront whoever was in that vehicle, but the other part of him, the part driven by caution, knew that might make things worse. He had no idea what these people were capable of or what they wanted from him. After a few more days of being followed, Anthony decided to take matters into his own hands. He began researching surveillance tactics, trying to understand why someone would follow him so closely without making direct contact. He read about private investigators, shady business deals, and even criminal organizations that used such tactics to intimidate their targets. "But I'm not involved in anything illegal," he reminded himself. "So what could this possibly be about?" Anthony's frustration grew into determination. He wasn't going to sit around waiting for answers anymore. One night he waited until the SUV had parked in its usual spot, just down the street from his house. Then, with his heart pounding in his chest, he grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. He approached the SUV cautiously, trying to keep his movements casual, but every step felt like a challenge. Just as he was about to knock on the window, the engine roared to life and the SUV sped off into the night, leaving Anthony standing there, bewildered. The abrupt departure of the SUV only heightened Anthony's suspicion. "They're watching me, but they're not ready to face me," he thought, the realization sending a chill down his spine. Whoever they were keeping their distance for a reason. But what could it be? Was it a warning, a message, or something worse? Anthony knew he couldn't live like this much longer. He needed answers, and soon. As the days passed, Anthony's sense of urgency grew. The SUV continued its surveillance, never too close but never far enough to forget. Anthony felt trapped in his own life, constantly watched but never approached. It was a kind of psychological warfare, and it was wearing him down. "This has to end," he muttered to himself one evening, his eyes fixed on the familiar shape of the black vehicle parked outside. But how could he make it stop? Anthony considered going to the police, but what would he tell them? That a black SUV had been following him for days. He had no concrete evidence of any wrongdoing, just a growing sense of unease. "They'll think I'm paranoid," he realized, shaking his head. Still, the thought of confronting this situation alone was overwhelming. He needed help, but he wasn't sure where to turn. And with Sophia still out of the picture, he had no one to confide in. One evening, after another long day of being followed, Anthony sat in his car, parked in front of his house, staring at the SUV down the street. His mind was racing, trying to piece together what could possibly be going on. "They must want something from me," he thought, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But what? And how far were they willing to go to get it? As he sat there, lost in thought, he realized that he had no choice but to find out. One afternoon, as Anthony was about to leave work, he noticed the black SUV parked at the end of the street again. It had become a routine now, but something felt different this time. The vehicle wasn't just sitting there. It seemed poised, as if waiting for something to happen. Anthony hesitated before getting into his car, his eyes locked on the SUV. What are they waiting for? He wondered, his nerves on edge. He took a deep breath and decided to drive home, but as soon as he pulled out of the parking lot, the SUV followed closely behind. This time, however, the SUV didn't just follow from a distance. A few blocks from his house, it sped up, pulling ahead of him and coming to a stop in the middle of the road, blocking his path. Anthony's heart pounded as two men stepped out of the vehicle, dressed in dark suits and sunglasses, like something out of a movie. "What the hell is this?" Anthony muttered under his breath as he watched the men approach his car. Every instinct told him to drive away, but he stayed put, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. One of the men knocked on Anthony's window. Reluctantly, he rolled it down, trying to keep his composure. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unease building in his chest. The man in the suit, tall and intimidating, looked him straight in the eye. "You helped someone recently, Sophia Montgomery," he said, his tone neutral but authoritative. Anthony's stomach dropped at the mention of her name. "Yeah, I helped her change a tire. Why?" he asked, though he had a sinking feeling that this was much bigger than a simple roadside favor. The second man, who had remained silent until now, handed Anthony a business card. "We represent her father, Joseph Montgomery. He'd like to express his gratitude for what you did," the man said, his voice smooth and professional. Anthony stared at the card, recognizing the name instantly. Joseph Montgomery was a well-known billionaire, and the realization hit Anthony like a ton of bricks. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath, glancing between the men and the black SUV. This was more than he had bargained for. The first man continued, "Mr. Montgomery appreciates your act of kindness and would like to offer you a token of his gratitude." Anthony frowned, confused. "A token of gratitude for changing a tire?" he asked, skepticism creeping into his voice. The men exchanged a glance as if they were used to this reaction. "It's not just about the tire. You helped his daughter when she needed it most. Mr. Montgomery values people who do the right thing without expecting anything in return," the second man explained, his tone almost rehearsed. Anthony couldn't believe what he was hearing. "So what exactly are you offering?" he asked, still unsure of where this was going. The men glanced at each other again before the first man spoke. "Mr. Montgomery is willing to offer you a choice, financial compensation, a new home, or a job opportunity that could change your life." Anthony's eyes widened in disbelief. This was the kind of offer that people dreamt about, but it felt too good to be true. "You've got to be joking," he said, half laughing in disbelief. The men didn't flinch. "We're serious, Mr. Anthony. You can take your time to think about it, but this is a real offer," the second man said, handing him a sleek envelope. Inside, Anthony found detailed information on each option: an obscene amount of money, a luxury house in an upscale neighborhood, and a high-paying job in one of Montgomery's companies. It was all laid out before him, as if his future had been planned by someone else. "This is insane," he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. But something didn't sit right with Anthony. Sure, the offer was tempting. Anyone in his position would jump at the chance to have their life transformed overnight. But Anthony was no fool. He knew that offers like these always came with strings attached. "Why me? Why is he offering all of this just for helping someone change a tire?" he asked, his tone cautious. The men exchanged another glance, and this time their expressions were less friendly. "Mr. Montgomery rewards loyalty. It's as simple as that," one of them said, though his tone hinted at something more. Anthony sat in silence for a moment, staring at the envelope in his hands. Everything about this felt wrong. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't think I can accept," he said finally, handing the envelope back to the men. Their expressions didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in the air, as if Anthony had just made a decision that would have serious consequences. "Are you sure, Mr. Anthony? This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity," the first man said, his voice smooth but firm. Anthony nodded, his gut telling him that this was the right decision, even if it didn't make sense. "Yeah, I'm sure. I'm not interested in deals that seem too good to be true," he replied, his tone resolute. The men exchanged one last look before the second man spoke. Very well, we'll inform Mr. Montgomery of your decision, but do understand, opportunities like these don't come around often. With that, the men returned to the SUV, leaving Anthony sitting in his car, his mind racing. As the black SUV drove off, Anthony let out a long breath. He had no idea what he had just turned down, but something in his gut told him it was the right choice. "I'm not getting involved in something I don't understand," he muttered to himself, still shaken by the encounter. But even as he tried to shake off the unease, Anthony knew that this wasn't over. The offer, the men, Sophia, they were all pieces of a puzzle that hadn't yet been fully revealed. As the days passed, Anthony couldn't stop thinking about the encounter with the men in suits. Their offer had been more than generous, life-changing even. But the more he thought about it, the more uneasy he felt. "There's always a catch," he muttered to himself, pacing around his living room. The envelope they had given him still sat on the coffee table, unopened since the day he handed it back. He couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if he had accepted. Would his life have been easier, or would he have been pulled into something much darker? Anthony sat down on the couch, staring at the ceiling. The offer kept replaying in his mind. Financial compensation, a new house, a better job. It was everything he had ever wanted, or so he thought, but something about it felt off. There was no such thing as a free ride, especially when it came from someone as powerful as Joseph Montgomery. "I've seen enough movies to know how this ends," he joked to himself, though the humor didn't ease the tension in his chest. At work, Anthony's colleagues noticed that he had been distracted lately. "You've been in your own world lately, man," one of them said during lunch. Anthony nodded, but he didn't offer any explanations. How could he? Telling them that two mysterious men in suits had offered him a fortune for a simple act of kindness sounded absurd. "Yeah, just got some things on my mind," he replied vaguely, hoping to steer the conversation away from the truth. But inside, his thoughts were spiraling. As the week dragged on, Anthony found himself questioning whether he had made the right decision. Turning down the offer had felt right in the moment, but now he wasn't so sure. "What if I missed out on the opportunity of a lifetime?" he thought, lying awake in bed one night. The weight of the decision was starting to settle in, and for the first time he felt a pang of regret. "Maybe I should have at least considered it," he mused, staring at the dark ceiling, his mind racing with what-ifs. The next morning, Anthony received another message from an unknown number. "We hope you've reconsidered. The offer still stands, but it won't be available forever." His heart skipped a beat as he read the text. The men weren't giving up easily. "They really want me to accept this," he muttered, feeling the pressure build. He couldn't help but wonder why they were so persistent. Surely Joseph Montgomery could find someone else to do whatever it was he needed. So why him? Anthony's thoughts continued to spiral as the day went on. Every time he looked at his phone, the message replayed in his mind. The temptation was there, the promise of an easy life, of never having to worry about money again. But with that temptation came a nagging sense of doubt. "What do they really want from me?" he asked himself. The question lingered unanswered as he tried to focus on his work, but no matter how hard he tried, the offer loomed over him like a shadow. As the day turned into night, Anthony found himself sitting on his porch, staring out at the empty street. The black SUV hadn't returned, but he knew they were still watching. "They're waiting for me to cave," he thought, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He pulled out his phone and stared at the message again. The offer was still on the table, but for how long? "I could just take the money and walk away," he thought, though he knew it wasn't that simple. Once he was in, there would be no walking away. Days went by, and the pressure to accept the offer only grew stronger. Anthony found himself questioning everything. His principles, his instincts, his gut feeling that something was wrong. "Maybe I'm overthinking this," he thought one afternoon. It's just an offer. People get offered jobs all the time. But deep down, he knew this was different. This wasn't just about a job or a house. There was something much bigger at play, something he wasn't seeing yet. Anthony's mind raced with possibilities. What if this was all a test? What if they were testing his loyalty, his ability to make decisions under pressure? The thought crossed his mind more than once, but it didn't ease the tension he felt. What if I fail the test, he wondered, pacing the room. He had never been the type to chase easy money, but this was different. The stakes were higher, and the consequences of his decision felt more permanent than ever. One evening, Anthony decided to clear his head with a walk. As he strolled through the neighborhood, he thought about the choices he had made in life and how they had led him to this moment. I've always trusted my gut, he thought, glancing up at the darkening sky. And my gut is telling me to stay away from this. But the doubt still lingered, gnawing at him. The men had made it clear that this offer wouldn't last forever, and as much as he wanted to stick to his principles, the temptation was becoming harder to resist. When Anthony returned home, he found himself standing in front of the coffee table, staring at the unopened envelope once again. He knew what was inside, promises of wealth, success, and an easier life. But at what cost? There's always a price, he whispered to himself, sinking into the couch. He picked up the envelope, feeling its weight in his hands. It was so tempting, so easy. All he had to do was say yes, but once he did, there would be no going back. The next day, Anthony made his decision. He wasn't going to accept the offer. It didn't matter how much money they offered or how good the job sounded. His gut was telling him that this was the right choice. I can't be bought, he thought, feeling a sense of clarity for the first time in days. He sent a simple reply to the unknown number. Thanks, but I'm not interested. As soon as he hit send, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had made his choice and there was no turning back. But even as Anthony felt a sense of peace with his decision, he knew this wasn't the end. The men in suits weren't the type to take no for an answer, and as much as he wanted to believe that walking away was the final chapter of this story, something told him that the real consequences of his choice were yet to come. Anthony sat in silence after sending the message, staring at his phone, waiting for a response that never came. He had made his choice, to turn down the tempting offer that could have changed his life in ways he couldn't even imagine. But now, the weight of that decision hung over him like a cloud. Did I do the right thing, he wondered, replaying everything that had happened over the past few days. The temptation had been strong, but his instincts told him to stay away. Still, doubt gnawed at him. As the hours passed, Anthony found himself reflecting on the crossroads he stood at. One path promised wealth, success, and comfort, while the other led to the unknown. By turning down the offer, he had chosen the harder path, one without guarantees. But isn't that what life is all about, he thought, trying to reassure himself. He had always believed that hard work and perseverance would pay off in the end, but now he wasn't so sure. What if he had just walked away from the opportunity of a lifetime? That night, as Anthony lay in bed, the doubts continued to swirl in his mind. What if I was wrong, he thought, staring up at the ceiling. What if this was my one shot to make something of myself? The men in suits had offered him a way out of his mundane life, a chance to escape the grind and live comfortably, but it had all felt too easy, too convenient. And Anthony had never been one to take the easy way out. I've always worked for what I have, he reminded himself, though the words felt hollow. The next morning, Anthony woke up feeling restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake. He went through his morning routine, but everything felt off. Maybe I should have at least considered it more seriously, he thought, sipping his coffee. But deep down, he knew why he had turned it down. There had been something about the offer, about the men in suits, that felt wrong. It wasn't just about the money or the job. It was about what accepting would have meant. He would have been indebted to them, and that was a price he wasn't willing to pay. As the days went by, Anthony found himself second-guessing his decision more and more. His life continued as normal. Work, home, the same routine, but the nagging thought that he had passed up something extraordinary lingered. Was I too quick to say no, he wondered, watching the world go by outside his window. His phone remained silent. The men hadn't contacted him again, and part of him was relieved. But another part of him, the part that craved adventure and change, couldn't help but feel like he had missed out. One evening, Anthony decided to go for a drive to clear his head. As he navigated the familiar streets, his mind wandered back to the day he had helped Sophia with her tire. It had been such a simple act, yet it had spiraled into something so much bigger. How did I get here, he thought, shaking his head in disbelief. He had never asked for any of this, yet here he was, caught in a web of choices and consequences that felt far beyond his control. As Anthony drove, he couldn't help but reflect on the lessons life had taught him over the years. Nothing worth having comes easy, he thought, repeating the words his father used to tell him. He had always lived by that mantra, believing that hard work and integrity would eventually pay off. But now, faced with the memory of the men's offer, he questioned whether that belief still held true. Maybe I've been too rigid, he mused, wondering if his principles had cost him a better future. When he got back home, Anthony sat in his car for a while, staring out at the quiet street. The black SUV hadn't returned, and there were no signs of the men in suits. It was as if they had disappeared as quickly as they had arrived, leaving Anthony to deal with the aftermath of his decision. I should feel relieved, he thought, but the unease in his chest told a different story. He had made his choice, but the consequences of that choice were far from clear. In the days that followed, Anthony tried to push the thoughts of the offer out of his mind, but they kept creeping back. At work, he found himself distracted, unable to focus on the tasks at hand. His colleagues noticed the change in him. "You seem off lately," one of them remarked. Anthony just shrugged. "I'm fine, just thinking about some stuff," he replied, though the truth was much more complicated. He wasn't just thinking, he was wrestling with the weight of his decision, wondering if he had thrown away a chance to change his life for the better. One night, unable to sleep, Anthony sat in his living room, staring at the unopened envelope on the coffee table. He had given it back to the men, but they had left another one behind as a reminder that the offer still stood. He hadn't had the courage to open it, afraid of what it might represent. Am I really going to let this haunt me forever? He wondered, reaching for the envelope. But as his fingers brushed the edge, he pulled back. He wasn't ready, not yet. The dilemma weighed heavily on Anthony's mind. He had always prided himself on being a man of principle, someone who didn't take shortcuts. But now, faced with the reality of his decision, he questioned whether he had been too idealistic. Maybe I've been too stubborn, he thought, pacing the room. Maybe I should have been more open to the possibility of change. But no matter how much he questioned himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about the offer had been wrong. In the end, Anthony knew that he couldn't go back and change his decision. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. But that didn't make the uncertainty any easier to bear. As the days turned into weeks, he found himself thinking less about the men in suits and more about what his future held. I can't dwell on this forever, he told himself one morning, determined to move forward. But the doubt lingered like a shadow he couldn't escape. After hearing Anthony's story, it's clear that life can throw unexpected challenges our way, often disguised as simple decisions. But what would you have done in his place? Would you have taken the tempting offer or followed your instincts like Anthony did? The choice between integrity and temptation is something we all face at different moments in life. Now it's your turn to reflect. Are you ready to make the tough decisions when they come your way? What principles guide you when the stakes are high? If you're inspired by Anthony's courage and the lessons from this story, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on more stories that can change the way you see the world. Let's keep learning together, so when life's next big decision comes, you'll be ready to face it head on.